to this week's meeting, our Wednesday meeting of the Norwich, Norfolk and East Anglia Socialist Workers' Party. We come from all quarters of the county, and it's nice to see everyone here tonight. The meeting is going to be recorded, but not the contributions. So if you won't, John's going to be, the speaker is going to be recorded, but you won't. We're going to do, the format for the meeting is, I'm chairing, my name's Mary, welcome everybody. John will be speaking for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then we will have time for questions, and we'll take questions first, which John can answer, and then we'll go into more general discussion if there's a point you want to make or something else that's a bit more detailed you want to go through. Okay, our speaker tonight is John Sinha from London, and the title of the meeting is Migration in an Era of Climate Catastrophe, which is something that's incredibly important. And I know John will go through it much more comprehensively than I could, but we are really living, as we've said before in meetings, in rather drastic times, and nothing seems to be getting any better any quicker. So I'm going to introduce John, and then we'll go for questions afterwards. If you don't know how to raise your hand, then put something in the chat or frantically wave at me. But there is a hand button, which I think most people in the meeting know how to use. So if you want to speak or ask a question, raise your hand and I will call you to speak. So over to John. Thank you, John.
Oh, yes. Good evening, comrades. Okay, yes. Climate change and climate chaos and climate refugees. I've been active in the climate movement now for over 16 years. And when I was first active in the climate movement, we never thought that climate change would be impacting us so rapidly and so quickly that 16 years later, we'd be talking about things like climate refugees so quickly. It was always something a bit abstract and something in the distance. But it has become a clear, and present reality, tragically for us in the world we're living today. Just before the lockdown, they were last year, I don't know if you may remember, there was disastrous flooding in Jakarta. The city got flooded, and there was the horrific fires in Australia, massive bushfires that incinerated half the country. I mean, in both cases, people were displaced. People had to evacuate their areas where they lived. And in the case of Jakarta, the people who were leaving were the rich. They had the money to go because the city is sinking. And it was the poor that were left to deal with the consequences of the bad planning, the disastrously bad neoliberal policies that have allowed the city to just sink. And so you have, a concept of the world's first disposable city in Jakarta. And when we talk about the so-called natural disasters, one thing we got to understand is there is not really very much natural about them. We do have extreme weather events. I mean, we've had them in the past. The difference that climate change is making is that they're becoming more severe and they're impacting more people. But we've had always climate events, climate emergence, environmental disasters that have, caused people to migrate. I mean, one needs to just think of the literature, John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, where people in the south and southern United States are escaping from the Dust Bowl caused by another ecological disaster, fleeing to California. Likewise today in Central America, because of climate change, a lot of poor campesinos, coffee production has collapsed because of climate change. They're migrating north to the United States, and they're being confronted by Trump's climate wall and his absolutely barbaric treatment of refugees by splitting up families. I mean, this is one of the big dangers in the current situation. When we talk about climate change, we just think of, the things that we need to do to mitigate, like flood prevention and, stopping carbon emissions and, building wind turbines and insulating houses. But there is also from the right the security response, which is to keep them out, keep the refugees out, keep them away, put them in detention centres. And this is one other response, possible response to the climate catastrophe we're facing. We are going to be facing millions of people being displaced. People are being internally displaced already. And this is one of the dangers in the current situation. I mean, when we talk about, the ecological breakdown caused by climate chaos, I mean, we talk about global warming, but it's actually not the warming itself which is driving people away. It's what the warming is causing. Thermodynamic heating of the planet is causing much heavier, what they call precipitation events. So when the rains come, you get more severe flooding, much more rain coming down, flooding areas, causing, disastrous flooding. You get these severe cyclones and typhoons and hurricanes. Remember, we can all remember Hurricane Katrina, what struck Louisiana, and, thousands of people drowned there. But, we've got other effects that we need to consider that causing displacement. For instance, the rising sea levels, causing, the people in many Pacific islands, their islands will disappear. They will just go underwater. And there's a big question, where are all these Pacific Island people going to move to? And now, the racist policies of, the Australian government, one of the chief culprits for the situation, are they going to now live up to their responsibilities and accommodate the Pacific Islanders who are going to lose their islands because of the inaction of the rich countries in not taking action on climate change? So we've got floods, storms, we've got the deadly droughts, of course, which are another sort of push factor because of the collapse of agriculture in certain parts of the world. We're finding that an exacerbation of conflicts over water. And we've seen, I will speak later about that, but we can talk about Syria and how, the civil war there, although not being caused by climate change, it was definitely an aggravating factor in making things worse, and especially with the irresponsible policies of the government there, of the Assad regime. So yeah, I want to go there. Let's just talk about here. Yes, as I was saying, climate, the natural disasters aren't natural, and the reason why they aren't natural is because the way a society responds to climate change is conditioned by many factors: the level of economic development, the dominant ideology of the society, and the response itself is mediated through other agencies like governments, the ability of governments to act, and other organizations. So, I mean, I'll give you an example of how societies respond to a disaster. You've got just in the news, you've got the story of how the government's track and trace system has been a total failure in dealing with, in tracking COVID-19 cases. Why? Because of the ideology of the government is to privatize the track and trace system. So they had a system which was dysfunctional, not working, but that was for ideological reasons, because somebody in the capitalist class must profit from this crisis. And therefore they had a system which didn't work. And therefore we've had 130,000 deaths. So you've got a more extreme example of this is Brazil with Bolsonaro, who's just saying, well, okay, you're dying from it. Well, tough luck, just get on with it, deal with it. The way that the government responds to a crisis, it could be either a climate one or it could be a pandemic, is ideological. And so what happens is these natural disasters become compounded and aggravated by the politics of the capitalist society. And we've seen this with COVID, and we're seeing also with climate change as well. And on the subject of, what is a climate refugee? I mean, it's a very complex subject. There is an organization called the International Center for Displaced Persons Monitoring that defines two types of displaced person: people that are displaced because of conflict, and people that are displaced because of natural disasters. Now, there is a problem here, because it's not easy to make this clear distinction between what is a natural disaster, a so-called natural disaster, and what is conflict. As I gave the example of Syria, where you've got a conflict, but there's also a climate element to it. And you can have other examples of natural disasters, so-called natural disaster, where there's a political conflictual element involved. I mean, that could be the case in a place, country like Burma, where you may have, a civil war going on, and then a natural disaster happening in that civil war, and then that civil situation being exacerbated. It could be in the Yemen, for instance. You could get these situations. So untangling natural disaster from conflict is not a simple thing. I've got some infographics here that I'd like to show you. I'm going to share my screen. I think you can see that. These are the graphs from the sources, the IDMC, International Center for Displaced Persons Monitoring. And what you see here is a graph of new displacements, conflicts and violence on the orange, and new displacements, disasters. And as you can see, what's happening is that we're getting more of these kind of environmental disasters happening. And they are now the big push and the big driver. Having said, with all the caveats I've given about the distinction between these two types, conflict, violence, and natural disasters, there is still, you can see this clear trend with the data that is pushing, is creating more displaced persons because of extreme things like so-called natural events. Of course, not all these so-called natural disasters are climate related. Some of them could be earthquakes, or some of them could be volcanic eruptions or stuff like that. But still, you can see a clear trend there from the period between 2003, so say from 2008 onwards, a clear big leap in these disasters. And I'm going to show you another graph. The other thing that we need to consider when we're talking about the refugees or people that are displaced from natural disasters is that the vast majority of these people are in the global south. It's not the case that people are migrating, climate refugees are migrating to the west. You see, the biggest numbers for displaced persons for natural disasters is India, China, and the Philippines. And then you've got the United States and Indonesia. These are all countries in the global south, with the exception of the United States. So, that is, clear sign that the people who are, it's the countries in the global south that are bearing the burden of having to, look after, millions of displaced persons and supply them with food and housing and water and medical attention, and they're not getting much, support from the from the Western countries. Yeah, so basically, as I said before, it's important not to create this linear relationship. The relationship between climate refugees and climate events is not a linear it's not a linear mechanical relationship. There are many factors which can push people to migrate, and climate is only one of them. I mean, I gave the example of, the coffee farmers in Central America who were migrating north. Well, I mean, there are other also political factors involved there. You've got, the coup in Honduras. You've got all the political violence in Central America that has been sponsored by US imperialism and the war on drugs. these are all factors that go into the mix. And so when people migrate, it's not easy simply to say they're climate refugees. Yes, climate change played a part in their decision to migrate. It was one of the push factors, but there are other push and pull factors involved. And so it's a very defining what a climate refugee is a very difficult thing to do. It's not a simple black and white distinction, although we should maintain that climate migration is a fact. It is happening, and it's going to be increasingly more serious because of climate change. But just bear in mind that we're not talking about a simple linear mechanical one-to-one relationship, but something which is very, very complex. So there's that question. Yeah, when we're talking about, for instance, Syria, one of the things about climate change and climate chaos is its tendency to exacerbate existing conflicts in society. So, for instance, you've got this happens to be the Middle East, for instance, an area and Egypt, areas which are quite arid and where rainfall and water is a scarce commodity. And what's happened is the way that the resources have been allocated in these countries has changed from being one which is more democratic because of the gains of, for instance, in Egypt, you had land reform, and you had peasants being given the land, and same thing happened in Syria with the development of neoliberal politics. You're getting the privatization of land. And you're getting, big business moving in, and they're swallowing up the resources. So this is what happened in Syria. So you had, the water scarcity, the shortage of water, which always existed in Syria, being made worse by climate change, and then that becomes an aggravating factor in the conflict there. It's important not to oversimplify the politics of the situation, and there were other things, we had the Civil War and the Revolution there. But, it is a factor that's playing into events throughout the world and is influencing and is conditioning those events in a myriad of different ways. And as I said before, one of the dangers of the current situation, and one that will become increasingly more visible, is as governments start to accept the reality of climate change, rather than push the solutions that we want in terms of things like Green New Deals, decarbonisation, protecting vulnerable communities. The response will be that we will get more military and security spending. We'll be getting more drones, more climate walls. That's what Trump's wall was. It was a wall to keep out climate refugees and people escaping from drought and poverty in Central America. We'll get this kind of a response, and it's very important that as socialists we talk about this issue of climate change, so we're able to equip the movement, the climate justice movement, and so it's in a better position to fight for the rights of climate refugees. And that brings me to the question of climate justice and solidarity. One of the things about what we call the climate justice movement, the movement I'm involved in, is this focus on solidarity with the global South, with indigenous communities, and when we had the global rebellions, for instance, when we had Fridays for Future, when we had XR, a global rebellion, we as socialists we've always been involved, in things like Stand Up to Racism, talking about the issue of climate refugees and the need for the movement to show solidarity with those people because we want to build a global movement. And so, socialists have always been actively involved in raising the issue of solidarity with climate refugees. I mean, we did that during the first XR rebellion in 2019. Stand Up to Racism organized an event in Marble Arch, one of the first XR events. The Campaign Against Climate Change was one of the first organizations to organize a conference in 2017 on the issue of climate refugees. And I think socialists have a very important role to play within the climate justice movement. We know capitalism has created the climate chaos, and it has also created the climate refugees. There don't need to be climate refugees. We could have a world where people are free to move for whatever reason they need to. They don't have to be pushed because of climate change. And so I think really the solution to the problem, and the solution is to overthrow capitalism. That is a solution to solving the climate crisis, as it is to solving any other crisis, and the best way to help people throughout the world and to stop making more climate refugees is to end capitalism. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very, very much, John. That was fascinating, and lots of questions arising from that, I think. Okay, if people...
and definitely capitalism, I would argue, is the root cause of the problem, because you have an economic system which is geared towards profit, and that profit is at any cost. So whatever, you know, environmental regulations you will pass under capitalism, they will always be subverted, and they have been. The idea of sustainable development we've had since the UN Environment Conference in '92, the idea of sustainable development came along, and that's led absolutely nowhere. There is no such thing as sustainable development under capitalism. It's a contradiction in terms. By definition, capitalism is an unsustainable system, and we need to argue that. But that doesn't mean that we make it a precondition that everyone we work with has to agree with us. We put forward the argument, the anti-capitalist argument, but we work with people who don't agree with us about the need to overthrow capitalism. Therefore, we need to be concrete and practical, get involved in the movement, but also don't drop our politics, and always be clear that we are anti-capitalist, and the solution is to overthrow capitalism, and that we don't have the time forever for capitalism to reform itself, to do that. I think Sue Carpenter asked a question. I think another question about strategy. You know, team up with the Green Party. Is the Green Party going to solve the climate crisis? I don't think so. I don't think they've got very good people in there, but you know, the Green Party has been around in one form or another for 40 years. I think it will be around, if the planet survives, for another 40 years in the same situation, because I don't think, you know, simply standing as an election and saying you're green is the way to change things. You have to build a movement on the ground, and you have to fight for change, and you have to understand that climate justice is a political struggle, and it has to be waged not just on the electoral camp, but on the streets, you know, occupation, strikes. These are the methods of political struggle, and these are the methods of the climate justice movement. I think I've answered that batch. Is there any more fish to fry?
Yep, there's a couple more questions, and then...
And by the way, before I actually get back, I just want to say that everything that I've said has been taken out of this article that Camilla wrote in the ISJ, and I've only really just touched on the subjects that she raised. She goes much deeper than I have in this discussion on those subjects. So I would recommend that, you know, comrades read up on it afterwards and get a deeper understanding. Let's just go. I think Wendy raised a very important issue, and when I agree with that, you know, about the working class. And the working class is absolutely central to achieving the sort of change we want to see, and that is living on a habitable planet. We won't live on a habitable planet if we allow capitalism to continue. And the force that has the power to change it is of course the working class. The thing is, it's obvious to us what the links are. You know, Wendy talked about the nurses' strike. She talked about the gas workers going on strike, and absolutely we support them as socialists. We see what the we see the connections. It's very clear to us. Working class agency and the rebuilding of working class agency is key to actually changing things. But the thing is, it isn't obvious to a lot of climate activists. It's not obvious to a lot of people in the Green Party why the working class is so important, why we talk about the working class and its centrality. It's not clear. It's obvious to us. It's not clear to other people. Why is it that it's not clear? Well, I think it's because how they see change in society arising, the way we see change happening is different to the way, say, people in the Green Party see change happening. People in the Green Party, the way they see change is that you elect green politicians and they do greeny things when they're in power. We know that the capitalist system won't allow any kind of radical reform of the system, and any kind of reform which would require saving the planet from climate change is a sort of reform that capitalism is not prepared to accept. And therefore, that's why we call for working class struggle to change things. Well, that's why we call for the overthrow of capitalism and for revolution, and for the creation of a new economic order, which is based on human need and which is rational in the way it allocates resources and the way the planet's resources are allocated, which takes me to the question of food production. And I think it was Catherine talked about food as a very important subject. The capitalist agriculture is destroying the planet. We've seen 80% reduction in insect biomass in the last 30 years. It's pushing us towards extinction of species and the collapse of ecosystems, and this is going to rebound on capitalism and lead to the collapse of agriculture itself. It's a very dangerous system. Capitalism is a system based on waste and destruction. That's why we need to have a different sort of food system. Marx talked about the metabolic rift, that the capitalist farming was impoverishing the soil. We're mining the soil, impoverishing it, and he showed how this was, he discussed it in the metabolic rift, how that was happening. I think it's a very important question. Pete talked about the Syrian Revolution, and it's, Pete's right, and Camilla also talks about it in the ISJ article. We definitely should, the thing about the Syrian Revolution is that it was an uprising of the people. I think, though, a lot of people, I think the reason why people want to talk about climate change or introduce the subject of climate change is because a lot of the explanations talk about jihadism. When they talk about, the thing is, the Syrian Revolution failed, and it failed because of jihadism. And I think people want to introduce other factors, and it wasn't simply a question of Islamism that led to the failure. They want to introduce other issues such as climate change, and I think it is a factor, but of course you're right. It is, we can't reduce the Syrian Revolution to climate change and water scarcity. They're all things that play a part, but the Syrian Revolution was an uprising against the Ba'athist, reactionary Ba'athist regime of Assad that was imposing a neoliberal agricultural and neoliberal policies on Syria, and the Syrian people revolted against that. Syrian farmers, Syrian students, and then it got then subverted into a sectarian, tragically into a sectarian war that led to millions of refugees. That's the real reason. But of course, there's loads of factors that come into play, and of course, climate change is one of them. And I think we shouldn't be reductive either towards talking about Islamism or climate change. There's loads of factors. The real reason why it failed was because of the lack of unity and the lack of revolutionary leadership. And those are the reasons that I would, give for the explanation in that account. Sue talked about passivity. Yes, we are in a situation where, Wendy talks about class struggle, and it's good to see that there are the strike of gas workers and other workers in other industries, but the level of strike is very, very low in our society. And I think on the left, we have a crisis of leadership. And I think the way that we can change things is by leading on the ground, leading campaigns, supporting strikes, making the links between workers' struggle and how society changes. I think that's the way to go about it. Was another question? Let's see. Did I answer all the questions? I think someone asked. I think it was a question about, do we need to relocate people now? Possibly we do. But what we need more is actually, I think, class struggle more than anything. Whether we definitely need to have put measures in place to mitigate, because climate change is coming, and cities like Amsterdam and Osaka, they are under threat, and that's a big question. What do we do about it? I don't have a simple answer to that question, I'm afraid. My answer to that question is we need to overthrow capitalism, and then create this rational society where we can have an intelligent discussion about what do we do about cities that are going to sink underwater. So I don't have a clear, simple answer to that question. Have I got any other? Mary talked about the USA and the why there are so many internally displaced persons in America. I think it's interesting because it's the only Western country on that list, and the point that list is making is that the majority of people that are internally displaced by disasters are in the global south and remain in the global south. They don't move into our country, or they don't cross borders. They are internally displaced. And with the case of the US, you could say that there is a third world in the US itself. There are people living in third world conditions. Such is the crisis of American society, that you have got, one of the richest country in the world. You've got some parts of the US, infant mortality, which is approaching third world levels, hunger, which is approaching third world levels. So when we talk about the United States, it's not simply this industrial superpower, it's also within it a third world country. Yeah, on the question of Rupert, the Green Party and Rupert Reed, I think he might have changed. I think he got so much stick from a lot of climate justice activists for his statement. I think he might have backtracked a bit on that, on his position on refugees. I'm not 100% sure. I think actually he might not even be spokesperson for XR anymore.
Couple of minutes, John, if that's okay.
Yeah, okay. I think I more or less said everything. I think though, I think people talked about the Greens. Yes, we have differences, strategic differences with them, but it's also important that we are able and know how to work with other people and build a movement and build an organized resistance and do things like opposing Sizewell C, because it's not an answer to the climate crisis. Building a nuclear power station, it's part of the crazy response to the climate crisis is the construction of nuclear. And it's very sad that the Labour in Suffolk is supporting nuclear expansion, because it's not the answer. It's a massive waste of resources. It's dangerous. It's next to the sea. A tsunami could hit the power station, and we see what we saw happen in Fukushima. That could happen. A tsunami could hit the coast of East Anglia, would be a disaster. So I'll leave it at that. If I haven't answered your questions, I'm sorry, but that's all I can say for the moment.
Thank you very